Saleh Hijazi, Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director of the Middle East and North Africa region and head of Amnesty International's Jerusalem office, is in South Africa and will be addressing Israel apartheid against Palestinians, a cruel system of domination and crimes against humanity launched tomorrow at the University of Pretoria. And she joins us now via Zoom. He joins us now via Zoom to tell us a little bit more about this visit. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so this must be a pretty important report for you to come all the way to South Africa to launch.
Well, I'm here in South Africa and other colleagues are all around the world. It is an important report because it does expose that the crime against humanity, a crime against humanity of apartheid is being perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians wherever Israel controls the rights of Palestinians in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. This system of oppression and domination it consists of four main pillars. It is the fragmentation of Palestinian communities into different geographic areas. It is the segregation within these areas and the violent control of them. It is the dispossession of landed property and the deprivation of basic rights. This system of oppression and domination amounting to apartheid has a clear intent that the report documents in statements by Israeli officials, but also in how this intent is reflected in laws, policies, and practices, where it is to maintain Jewish hegemony, Jewish Israeli hegemony, both in terms of demography and geography, wherever Israel exerts control over land, meaning to have Jewish Israelis as the majority in the population, and for that majority to control maximum amount of land. Now, to maintain this system, Israel also perpetrates crimes that are defined under international law as crimes against humanity, including forced transfers, which include under it home demolitions, forced evictions, and the creation of coercive environments to push Palestinians out of this territory, decrease the number of Palestinians, but also the use of arbitrary detention and torture, the use of unlawful killings, and the use of persecution against Palestinians. Therefore, Israel, in committing these crimes to maintain this system of oppression and domination, is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. This can be seen, for example, in the Naqab, where Palestinian Bedouins there hold Israeli citizenship, but they're treated as second or third class citizen as compared to their Jewish counterparts. They live in, many of them live in what is called unrecognized villages. The Israeli state does not recognize these villages, does not provide them electricity, does not provide them with water, education, or any of the basic services, and have continuously demolished their homes, forcibly moving them out of these areas. Now, it's important to note that these communities have been already forcibly displaced in 1948 and around the time that Israel was established in what Palestinians call a Nakba, where there was ethnic cleansing and forced displacement of hundreds and thousands of Palestinians. That was an essential act of fragmentation. So many of these peoples have been displaced one or two times, and now many of them, thousands of them, are facing the threat of forcible displacement again. There are 150,000 Palestinians currently living under the threat of either losing their home or being forcibly evicted out of their home. Jewish Israelis do not face this reality. In the Naqab, for example, Jewish farms that are owned by single families are provided hundreds of dunums, massive amount of land. They're provided water, they're provided electricity, they're connected to the infrastructure. They have polling stations, for example, closer to them. And although these Palestinians and the Naqab are citizens, they're not even provided the infrastructure so that they can practice their right to political participation.
All right.
This image that is in Naqab, is reflected elsewhere.
All right, so let's unpack some of this. I mean, we use the word apartheid, and so help our viewers, particularly here in South Africa. Our understanding here was being sent to homelands, Bantustans, and you couldn't leave there without permission, and you needed a special pass to travel and work in certain areas. Certain job opportunities were denied to you, and all of this was based on the color of your skin and your ethnicity. Is this what we're seeing in Israel, Palestine?
Indeed, this is part of the system, but not the entirety of it. There are many comparisons with South Africa, but there are also many differences. Take the Gaza Strip, for example. It has been called by the UN as the largest open prison in the world. People there have, since 2007, been placed under an illegal military blockade that amounts to collective punishment. They cannot leave the territory. They cannot visit family that are in other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories, like in the West Bank. They cannot leave for education. They cannot trade. They cannot move in goods and services, goods in or out of the Gaza Strip. Fishermen are allowed just a few nautical miles, which would not allow them to basically get any fish. Farmers are not allowed to use lands because they're called buffer zones. So this is Gaza is a stark example of what, using South African terminology would be called the Bantustan. And actually, a partner organization, Al Mizan, have put out a report at the end of last year called the Gaza Bantustan, basically using the apartheid legal analysis to explain the situation in Gaza. But the situation is also similar in elsewhere. Palestinian citizens of Israel, like, for example, I mentioned the Palestinian Bedouins and the Naqab, are forced into these segregated community. They're inside an area called the Siyaj, where, all right, their rights are not as violently controlled as those in Gaza, but they still face severe restrictions when it comes to the enjoyment of their rights as compared to Jewish Israeli citizens of Israel. Palestinians in the West Bank are also kept into segregated areas in between illegal settlements that amount to war crimes and have hundreds, there are more than 100 checkpoints that control their freedom of movement. Palestinians in East Jerusalem, one third of them, the 300,000, one third of them live behind what is called the separation. Palestinians call the segregation wall, a separation wall that is a military structure, military checkpoints that violently control their freedom of movement. Which, of course, as you know, controlling freedom of movement also affects your right to work, right to education, right to be with the family, and this is all because you are Palestinian. Because Jewish Israelis don't face that. Jewish Israelis are able to move freely within the country. They're free to work in whatever profession they want. They're provided education. They can travel in and outside of the country freely. The difference and the discrimination is stark. And yes, segregation and control is a main part of the system of oppression and domination that amounts to Israel's apartheid against Palestinians.
And I suppose the issue of right to return, if you're Jewish and you're anywhere in the world, you can come back to Israel with open arms. But if you're Palestinian, you don't enjoy the same rights.
Absolutely. There are over 6 million Palestinian refugees who were forcibly displaced in 1948 and again in 1967, who are denied the right of return. Many of them still live in refugee camps in horrendous circumstances and situation. And so if you're Jewish anywhere, as you said, anywhere around the world, there's the law of return that allows you to come to Israel and receive Israeli citizenship upon arrival. Right when you arrive, there's no process, you become an Israeli citizen. While Palestinians who are kicked out of their homes are not allowed and continuously denied their right to return. This is another main pillar of the system, because allowing Palestinians to return means that the demography, that intent to maintain demographic hegemony by Jewish Israelis will be no longer there. And therefore, this is why in our report, we document, including by analyzing the body of laws, policies, and practices with regards to Palestinian refugees, how this is a main pillar of Israel's apartheid system against Palestinians.
So my question to you is, what's new in this report? Because a lot of what you're saying really has been since 1948, more especially post-1967. This has been the story. What do we get more from this report, or are you just reminding us of the scenario that's been playing out for decades?
No, the report provides legal analysis. It uses international law, how apartheid was codified in international law as a crime against humanity, in analyzing the situation. But you're right. Amnesty put out this report after Human Rights Watch put out a report saying that Israel is committing the crime against of apartheid, against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians. B'Tselem and other Israeli organizations have done so before Human Rights Watch. And it's very important to note that Palestinian human rights organizations have been saying and using this framework of analysis for more than 20 years now. What is important about Amnesty coming out of this now is that we complete the consensus among the international human rights movement working on the human rights situation in Israel and Palestine by saying that Israel is imposing a system of apartheid against Palestinians that amounts to a crime against humanity that has no place in our world, and this is a turning point. This consensus is now being pushed by us and others working in partnership. We're mobilizing our membership so that it spreads, so that now states also recognize the situation for what it is. We have recognition among civil society organizations. Now we want states to recognize the situation for what it is, because there's a not only moral obligation on states to act against the crime against humanity, but there's a legal obligation for states to do so. Very important that we have this consensus now, and it is a turning point. And from here on, it is basically saying how we, working together with other partner organizations, pushing states, will dismantle this system of oppression and domination that amounts to apartheid.
All right, and then perhaps finally, Tel Aviv will say, hang on, Israel has a right to exist, and the reason we have all of these extreme measures is because we're facing rockets every single day, and that if we relaxed the rules, people would come into Israel and kill us all.
The security argument has been used by Israel to justify its oppression, systematic oppression against Palestinians. Israel, as any state, has a right to maintain security, its security, and the security of everybody that lives under its control. That means also the security of Palestinians. But what we have is that a system that basically allows for the domination of one racial group, here Jewish Israelis, over Palestinians, that has no justification in security. It has justification in the intent to maintain this system of oppression and domination by one racial group over another. The checkpoints, the separation of families, like me, for example, I'm a Palestinian citizen of Israel. My partner is a Palestinian from the West Bank. According to Israeli laws, I'm not able to pass my legal status to her. She's not allowed to become an Israeli citizen. This does not apply to Jewish Israelis. This means, like, for example, our children are only registered to me, not to her. They cannot travel with her. That also means that she cannot travel to visit with me family who live in Jerusalem without applying to a permit. To apply to a permit, she'll need to go and do an interrogation at the Israel Security Agency, which is many times degrading, humiliating, and can be actually a threat and a danger to Palestinians applying for a permit. This does not apply to Jewish Israelis. There is no security justification when it comes to separation of family, the restriction on the freedom of movement, the segregation of Palestinians, the building of walls, the confiscation, the discriminatory confiscation of land, and not allowing access to them. Palestinian citizens of Israel, for example, like myself, are denied access to 80% of land inside of Israel. And this is only because we are Palestinian. Jewish Israelis do not face the same thing. There is no security justification for this system of oppression and domination. It is apartheid. It's a crime against humanity.
Saleh, we'll leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed for giving us some insights into this report, which I think everybody ought to read. Is this going to be available on your website?
Yes, absolutely. It's available in a number of languages. We also have a human rights education course available online that takes audiences through a journey, educational journey about what apartheid is under international law, how apartheid came about in history with a comparative view of South Africa and Palestine and Myanmar, which is another situation Amnesty found there is apartheid, and then also the Palestinian experience under apartheid. So there's a report, a human rights education course, and many other materials available online.
Saleh, thank you very, very much indeed, and good luck with your launch tomorrow. Take care. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Saleh Hijazi talking to us about Amnesty International's latest report on Israel being an apartheid state. And you can go onto their website, download this report, read it for yourself and get an understanding of what's going on in the Middle East.